Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Almassian. We have to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine because we have to preserve the rules-based order. We have to oppose the Chinese aspirations somehow in Far East Asia, because we are against imperialism, and we have to oppose any sort of skirmish by the Russian forces into Bakhmut and other places, because we have to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and we have to respect the sovereignty of other countries. And that's why the United States is here policing the world, guys, because the United States' role is to establish a rules-based order based on law, regulations, international law, pink flags everywhere, and everybody is living in peace and harmony, right? The truth of the matter is it's way further and far away from this. So the US occupation forces are now establishing a new base in Syria, where I come from. So they're building a new site in Syria. This is from the antiwar.com. It says the US-led anti-ISIS coalition is building a new military base in Syria's northern province of Raqqa, citing a source close to the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. The US backs the SDF and keeps about 900 troops in eastern Syria, allowing the US to control about 1/3 of Syria's territory. The report said there are currently about 24 US-led military sites spread throughout eastern Syria. While the US says it's in Syria to fight ISIS, the presence is part of Washington's economic war against Damascus, which includes crippling economic sanctions. ISIS also holds no significant territory, and the Syrian government and its allies would continue to fight the remnants of the terror group if the US withdrew. But the construction of a new base demonstrates the US plans to continue the occupation indefinitely. The House of Representatives in the US voted to maintain sanctions on Syria after an earthquake killed thousands of Syrians. Only 2 members of Congress voted against the legislation. The US could come under pressure to withdraw from Syria and lift sanctions on the country as more and more regional countries are normalizing ties with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Saudi Arabia spearheaded an effort to bring Syria back into the Arab League despite US objection. Guys, I'm gonna show you, this is the map of control over Syria. So this is from Syria.liveumap.com. It's a pro-American, pro-Ukrainian site, but that doesn't change the fact that the mapping is highly accurate here. So the yellow part are the US occupation forces and the so-called SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. This site, it is rich with the oil, fuel, gas, and wheat. So the food basket and the energy resources. Now, the US says that they're in Syria to fight ISIS, right? Or to block the re-emergence of ISIS. But if you check the map, this pocket is ISIS pocket, the black ones. This is an ISIS pocket. This is an ISIS pocket, this. So you can see there are around 4 to 5 ISIS pockets in the deserts of Syria, and they are all on the side, on the western shore of the Euphrates, where the US or where the Syrian army is stationed, where the Syrian allied forces are stationed. So there are no ISIS pockets where the US occupies. All ISIS pockets are near the Syrian army site. And there is the Euphrates, guys. This is the Euphrates. You see, this is the contact line between the Syrian army and the US occupation forces. So if ISIS wants to attack on the American occupation forces, they have to cross the river. So it's a very hard thing to do. So what's happening here is actually these pockets are attacking the Syrian army positions. And sometimes they're coming from this pocket into this, you see this road here? They're coming here and they are bombing civilian buses. So this is what ISIS is doing. And there are so many reports. This green area, guys, is also occupied by the US Army. It's Al Tanaf border crossing. And there are so many reports that there are remnants of ISIS. They are living either inside this pocket that the US occupies or on the surrounding parts of the pocket. So they're allowing them to operate here, and they are letting them go and attack on the Syrian army positions. And if the Syrian army tries to come anywhere close to this pocket, they're being targeted by the US occupation forces. So all in all, whoever tells you that the US is in Syria to fight ISIS or to block the reemergence of ISIS, you can show them this map and tell them you are a fucking liar. Now, a lot of people asking me, so what's the solution? How can we push back or kick out the US occupation forces from Syria? And recently, the Washington Post published a new article that says Iran plans to escalate attacks against US troops in Syria, documents show. Iran is arming militants in Syria for a new phase of lethal attacks against US troops in the country, while also working with Russia on a broader strategy to drive Americans from the region, intelligence officials and leaked classified documents say. Iran and its allies are building and training forces to use more powerful armor-piercing roadside bombs intended specifically to target US military vehicles and kill US personnel, according to classified intelligence reports obtained by the Washington Post. Such attacks would constitute an escalation of Iran's long-running campaign of using proxy militias to launch rocket and drone strikes on US forces in Syria. Drone attacks have wounded 6 US servicemen and killed a Defense Department contractor. And the new explosive device could add to the toll of US casualties, risking a wider military confrontation with Iran, current and former intelligence analysts and weapons experts say. The document, part of the trove of classified materials leaked on the messaging platform Discord, appears to be based on intercepted communications by Syrian and Lebanese militants allied to Iran. Another document in the trove describes a new and broader effort by Moscow, Damascus, and Tehran to oust the United States from Syria, a long-sought goal that could allow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to reclaim eastern provinces now controlled by US-backed Kurdish forces. The past 3 US administrations have maintained a small contingent of US troops in Syria, about 900 at any given time, augmented by hundreds more contractors to prevent a resurgence by Islamic State militants in the country toward Iranian and Russian ambitions and provide leverage for this strategy. So the first objective is a complete bullshit. I just proved to you that they are not there to prevent a resurgence of ISIS militants in the country. They are actually embedded with ISIS and they are helping ISIS and allowing them to operate, to conduct attacks on the Syrian army positions and even civilian positions. But one of the objectives of the United States is to thwart Iranian and Russian ambitions in Syria. That's true. And the second is to provide the leverage for other strategic objectives, which means they want a so-called political process that could lead into diminishing the powers of Assad and giving the so-called opposition, which is mostly supported, funded, financed, and everything by either Qatar or the United States. There were no indications in the documents of direct Russian involvement in planning the bombing campaign, but the leaked documents point to a more active role by Moscow in the broader anti-US effort. So this was the article. I just wanted to take the best parts in it and show you what the Americans are saying in this regard. And they are worried that the Iranian-backed militias would increase their attacks on the US occupation forces and the quality of the attacks. And I have to tell you something here, guys. You have to know something very important. The Iranian advisors or Iranian-backed militias that the Americans call them do not operate independently from the central government of Damascus. Anything that Iran does in Syria coordinates with the defense ministry and with the presidency. So any escalatory efforts, especially military efforts, whether it's against Israel or against the US occupation forces, are all coordinated between Damascus, Tehran, And also Moscow is always been informed if there is such attacks are going to happen, because Russia has also some sort of agreements with the American forces so that they avoid certain aerial accidents or even ground accidents. So the Syrian side, if this report is true, if these leaked documents are true, you can rest assured that it's been approved by Damascus, and it's been coordinated by Damascus, and it's been supervised by Damascus. Iran doesn't operate independently. Iran operates in coordination and also with full acceptance of Damascus and with the Syrian army. The Syrian army is playing a role here, but they always try to say that those are Iranian-backed militias, and they want to give the impression that they operate independently from the Damascus, and Damascus doesn't consent to give the impression that one, Iran and Russia are occupiers in Syria, and two, when the Iranians or the Russians attack American forces, it may not be considered a resistance, but if Damascus is coordinating these attacks and it's the spearhead of these attacks against the American occupation forces, legally speaking, this is resistance, and you are allowed to use military force against an occupying force and kick them out of your country. So rest assured, Damascus knows everything on the ground if Iran is taking such escalatory decision or steps. Now, I want to show you some parts of Vanessa Billy's article. She, again, addressed this issue, and I think this is an important article. I will also put the link in the description below. She says, reports are coming from a sizable Russian military convoy heading for the east of Dore governorate in the northeast of Syria. This deployment of Russian troops coincides with reports of the arrival of Iranian military equipment to the area and the extensive build-up of the Syrian Army 17th Infantry Divisions on the banks of the Euphrates River. So as I mentioned to you guys, this is if these documents are accurate and these reports are accurate, the Syrian army is the one who is leading this operation. And Vanessa Billy mentions here the 17th Infantry Divisions of the Syrian army are building up on the banks of the Euphrates River. So this is not like Iranian-backed militias. No, this is the regular army of the of Syria. And on each side, there are paramilitary groups that fight alongside the Syrian army. If you want to call them Iranian-backed militias, call them whatever you want, but they're operating under the supervision and the guidance of the Syrian army. On the 1st of June, the CIA-aligned Washington Post published an article entitled "Iran Plans to Escalate Attacks Against U.S. Troops in Syria, Documents Show." Washington Post claims that the Discord leaks exposed a covert plan to kill Americans, which is seen as part of a larger Russian-backed strategy to oust the U.S. from Syria. Of course, we should ask, Vanessa says, why Washington Post needs leaked documents or intelligence officials to inform them that Syrians do not appreciate the illegal occupation of 1/3 of Syrian territory, unlawful U.S. military bases, regular kidnap and killings of Syrian civilians by U.S. military, theft of oil and agricultural resources, on top of a 12-year of hybrid war to topple the Syrian government using terrorist proxies. Could Washington Post or other U.S. media outlets not figure out for themselves that a pushback against U.S. violation of international law was inevitable using the alliances that have supported Syria throughout history? I guess not. She is asking a legitimate question here, in my opinion. Iran's long-running campaign of using proxy militias to force U.S. military out of Syria. The U.S. should not be in Syria, and it is using proxy terrorist groups to force an internationally recognized Syrian government out of power while economically suffocating the Syrian people and sadistically depriving them of their essential resources. If Americans allow their military to be used to commit crimes in Syria, what do they expect? Americans will be killed eventually, and rightfully so. The article of the Washington Post reiterates U.S. claims that they are in Syria to prevent a resurgence of ISIS, but this is palpably untrue. There have been multiple local reports of the U.S. storing ISIS fighters in the various prison camps dotted across the northeast, aided and abetted by the Kurdish separatists who act as alleged prison guards for these camps. See, guys, like this is not something that I am just making up. Every serious investigative journalist knows, anyone who understands some geography knows, but you don't expect ordinary people to just open a map and check what's happening on the ground. But we know that the US is embedded with ISIS in Syria. Since the double earthquake struck Syria on the 6th of February, there has been an increase in ISIS attacks, particularly on Syrian civilians to the east of Homs. You remember I just showed you on the map where they were attacking? This is what she mentions here again. There have been reports that the Pentagon is forming a rebranded military brigade that will comprise the so-called Free Syrian Army and ISIS fighters to carry out attacks on the Syrian Arab Army and Russian positions. ISIS is another proxy of the US alliance in Syria, and this has been clear since John Kerry was recorded in a UN closed session describing how the Obama administration allowed ISIS to flourish in the hope it would topple the Syrian government in Damascus. Of course, the US is responding to the threat to its illegal military presence in Syria by doubling down on the economic pressure on Syrian civilians and fury at their Arab League normalization of relations with Syria, ending in President Assad's defiant speech at the recent Arab League summit. And then she links my video here. Islamic group in Washington conspires with neocons against Syria, and this was about the Council on American Islamic Relations, who are advocating for a new law against Syria, which will criminalize the normalization of relations with Damascus by the federal government in the US, and also it will bulldog and threaten regional governments for restoring ties with Syria and threatening them with sanctions. And 3, they will broaden the sanction orgies on the Syrian people. So how the fuck they call themselves Muslims, and they are supporting a neocon bill that will suffocate millions of Muslims in Syria? It's just beyond me. But you know who is against US imperialism and US sadism in Syria? Jimmy Dore. And I like Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore is an American comedian. You all know him. And he made a segment. It's 7.5 minutes. I will just show you the first 3 minutes where he speaks about this case. And I really appreciate that someone like Jimmy Dore brings attention to the American audience about the Syrian case. And he criticizes the US foreign policy that is based on imperialism, neocolonialism, and also sadism. Take a look.
Guess what? They're building a new military base in northern Syria. As we condemn Putin for invading Ukraine, that was provoked, we're occupying a third of Syria, and we're building military bases you sent me. Can you send me that again? So you remember when Trump said this? They asked him, hey, why are you leaving troops in Syria? And this is what he said.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
Do it again. One more time. One more time.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
That's why they hate him, ladies and gentlemen, because he tells a truth like that every once in a while. They don't hate him because he's lying in Washington. They hate him because he every once in a while tells the truth. And here's another stooge from the State Department to tell you how the American State Department feels about Syria.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now,
so the third of Syria, you heard she said the third of Syria that was owned by the U.S. military. That's how they look at it.
Where do they learn to talk like that?
That's how
we're taking their stuff and going in there. You're like more conducive to our interests.
More conducive to our interests.
With that Rachel Maddow look on her face.
It was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria study group's report. And then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation.
Okay, so it's just about how we are terrorists and we go in and we kill people in other people's countries and make them do what we want.
Jimmy,
That's what she's saying. That's another way to say what she just said.
Osama bin Laden, when he would send those Christmas cards that I was going to kill us, was more likable in them than her right now saying this. He had more charisma while he was going to say.
So this is the part of Syria we're controlling, and here's all our bases. That's all the bases we have in fucking Syria.
Wait, are they a sovereign nation? I don't know what that means. I just know that.
So this is the part with the oil, and this is the part that grows the food, and that's the part that the United States is occupying. And this is, again, all about oil. They wanted to send a pipeline through there.
Hydrocarbons, Jimmy.
Hydrocarbons, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Isn't it hilarious that a comedian like Jimmy Dore, he knows more about Syria and the map of control and why the US occupation forces are stationed there than so many so-called experts on Syria, political commentators, those who claim to be influencers on social media platforms? Isn't it crazy that the US claims to be championing rules-based order and trying to preserve international relations, regulations, laws, and the dignity of human beings while they're suffocating millions of Syrians with sanctions, crippling sanctions, I would say, sadistic sanctions, occupation of their wheat, their food basket, their oil, their energy resources after 12 years of regime change war that destroyed half the country. This was led by the United States. If this is not sadism, if this is not psychopathy, if this is won't enrage you and encourage you to work for a change in the world order, I don't know what else should do. I encourage you guys to go on social media and make a noise about this case, and you have to believe me. During the after the earthquake, our pressure on social media platforms relatively worked, and the US backtracked a little bit, just a half a step, by freezing some of the sanctions on only the transactions. They were just cosmetic, I would say, like a backtracking, but we have to continue our lobbying. We have to continue our work, because there are millions of Syrians now, 90% of them under poverty line, and they are just your fellow humans, and they are suffocating, and they need your voice, and they need you to speak about them, and they need you to speak with your congressmen and congresswomen and ask them not to vote no to the new bill that they're going to vote in the Congress few days from now, that is called the Anti-Assad Normalization Act or something like this. So if you live in the US and you want to help the Syrians, the best thing you can do is call your congressman, congresswoman, and tell him and her to vote no to this sadistic new bill. I've been your host, Almassian of Syriana Analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and we learned something together. And if you're new, subscribe, hit the like button, and also share it with your friends so other people know what's happening in Syria, because they might think the war is over, but it's not yet. And if you want to support my independent work like this, please become a patron. Link in the description below.